Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. On behalf of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation and U.S. Friends of the Foundation, I welcome all of you here today. These virtual events are one small way that we strive to carry on the memory and values of our hero, mentor, and friend, Ahmed Kathrada. Given Kathy's embrace of humanity across every division of race, religion, and nationality, it's fitting that today's event is truly global in reach, with participants from across South Africa, America, Canada, Europe, and I've probably missed a continent or two, but all of you are welcome. The focus of this gathering is also a deeply fitting tribute to Kathy, who alongside Nelson Mandela repeatedly put his life and liberty on the line to bring down apartheid and secure voting rights for all. We are so pleased to welcome Justice Malala, author of the new book, The Plot to Save South Africa, The Week Mandela Averted Civil War and Forged a New Nation. The book, just published earlier this month by Simon & Schuster in America and by Jonathan Ball in South Africa, is already receiving critical acclaim. As many of you know, Justice is one of South Africa's most renowned political commentators, as well as an award-winning journalist, a TV host, a longtime weekly newspaper columnist, and the former publisher of the Sowetan and the Times. His work has been featured in the Washington Post, The Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the Times of London, among many others. His previous book, We Have Now Begun Our Descent, How to Stop South Africa Losing Its Way, was a #1 bestseller in South Africa. Interviewing Justice will be my friend Renee Montaigne, a trusted journalistic voice who has kept many of us informed and enthralled for years, and who shares our deep love for South Africa. As many of you know, Renee is a special correspondent and host for National Public Radio. From 2004 to 2016, she co-hosted Morning Edition, widely program, and she kept all of us company on the way on our drives to work. Before that, she co-hosted the acclaimed NPR program, All Things Considered. In early 1990, Renee went to South Africa to cover Nelson Mandela's release from prison after 27 years behind bars. She and a small team of NPR reporters were awarded an Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Silver Baton for their coverage of South Africa's historic 1994 elections. Her journalist work has been recognized with many other awards, including a Peabody, a George Polk, and Harvard's Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Journalism. We are truly honored to have Justice and Renee here with us today. And now let's turn the spotlight over to them.
Unmute down. There. I just unmuted myself.
Please replace, there we go. And you can take me off now.
So, and I see Justice, you two are ready to talk.
Yeah.
I just want to say something myself very quickly. Thank you so much, Sharon, for that, lovely introduction of me. I will say I was a happy journalist that I more or less covered I was more or less in the country through the 1994 elections. So to be in South Africa for 5 years, and I would come back to Washington occasionally where I was based, but to be in South Africa for those 5 years was it couldn't be a more peak experience for a journalist. It was the major story of the 20th century, and among, obviously, but could be right at the top easily. So I am familiar, but nothing. It's a book of, it's a mystery, in some sense, the way you've crafted it, which is 9 days from Chris Hani's death to his funeral, and what happened there that allowed the country not, in fact, to plunge into war and bloodshed. So it's a beautifully written book. It's quite an amazing book, and I just have to say that myself. We're not we're not friends, we've just met, but I would recommend it to just about anybody because it contains an enormous amount of history and a lot of new information. And even for people like many in this in this group here, I think, who know very much about everything that was happening there, some of you who were right there in the middle of it. I think there's something for everybody. For me, it gave me a really strong sense of what I didn't know at the time, and I was all alone in South Africa, covering everything that happened. So you can imagine I missed a lot of especially the inner workings. So to get to the book called "The Plot to Save South Africa," and when I say it's a bit of a mystery, I think the title's an interesting one, Justice. I rarely ask people about their titles, but in this case, the plot would have seemed to be to murder Chris Hani. But the country and its leaders and characters, and you have a list of characters, which is how it feels, made sure that plot was spun totally around and turned into the plot that saved South Africa.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Renee, for your kind words about the book and about the story of arriving in South Africa on February 11, 1990. It was such a heady time. It was a time when so many of us were the darkness was being lifted over South Africa, and it was a time of hope, a time of incredible belief in building a new country and being part of building a new world. At the beginning, Sharon spoke about the values that Ahmed Kathrada upheld throughout his life. I think seeing in one's lifetime, seeing in one's career as a journalist, those values be given the possibility of coming alive and being entrenched in a country that had gone through 46 years of apartheid was incredible. So many of us were I was lucky to have been, to have had a job, to have been given one. The title of the book comes from The Plot to Save America, which was about imagining at the 1940 election in the US, if you will, the Hitler supporting candidate had won, and what kind of country that would have been. And my aim was to go back to that time of incredible, amazing leadership and try to say, we could have gone this way, but we didn't. And why didn't we? And we can talk about why we didn't and delve into the book. But I wanted to explicitly, I think in a time like this that the world is going through, I wanted to explicitly celebrate the values that Sharon spoke about, that made leadership so unique and necessary in that 4-year period that you and South Africa, you and your colleagues were reporting about South Africa. I wanted to revisit that because I think we're losing sight, not just in South Africa, I think all over the world, of what values-based, values-driven leadership can achieve. So this is, in many ways, I wanted to celebrate that moment. I wanted to celebrate those people. They were my heroes. They were many people's heroes. And I think we haven't turned enough to them for lessons, for directions forward. And I hope this is a little contribution to that.
Well, one thing you do in the book, why it's so, excuse me, it's so rich, is you actually, from the very beginning, touch on points of where a separate path could have been taken. Moments of actual, here's two choices. They always seem to be, not two literally, but what the obvious choice maybe, and what the one that was taken, where the correct, for the most part, not in every moment, but that when we look back, you almost scratch your head and say, thank God, or boy, who knew, or or that. So it has a sensation of a series of turns, and all of them keep going towards, thank God, the light. And one of the first ones, interestingly enough, it is in Dawn Park, where Chris Hani was living. Unusual, rather, because sort of a middle-class Afrikaans, very white, little suburban area. I think you said the words that you said, an unlikely hero is someone you could call her, which was the neighbor who, right at the beginning when he's killed, who spots it, and Retta, I think, is that how you pronounce it? Would you pronounce her name, Retta?
Yeah,
Harmse. She did something that it would not be natural. She was the witness to this murder.
Yes. And Rita Harmse was a neighbor, knew Chris Hani. Chris Hani was a very popular figure in that neighborhood. He was unusual. There had been some Black families that had moved into the neighborhood, but it was still a largely white suburb. In fact, Boksburg was the last town council in South Africa to desegregate, as it were. This is 1990, it's so recent. You sit there and you say 33 years ago, people still didn't want that segregation. But
they kept up the signs initially, did they not?
Absolutely. And we sit here with the gift of the liberation of 1994. But just 34 years ago, this was a town that proudly was segregationist. And in 1990, those signs started coming down. Things began to change. A few people moved into the neighborhood, including the Hani family and a few others. Journalists, middle-class Blacks basically started breaking that down. Rita Harmse was very typical of white South Africa, if you will, at that time. She worried about property prices. Oh, what does it mean when Black people come in, and these kinds of concerns. But Chris Hani moved in, the family stayed, and they were curious about their new neighbor. They'd seen him running. He always told everyone that, I'm getting fit so that when freedom arrives, I'm going to look lovely and trim. That was always his joke to his neighbors. And so she sees the killer basically stopping behind Chris Hani's car at the gate, walk in, shoot him. She witnesses this and turns around, sees the registration plate, and goes to her home and calls the police. And in the book, I managed to get the transcript of the conversation with the cops, and essentially she gives the crucial information: the color of the car, the look of the person driving it, and the registration number. And that leads to his arrest within 35 minutes of the killing itself. But the importance of that moment, and exactly what the key thing is, that the aim of this entire thing is to spark racial animosity. It's to say, a white man has shot our hero Chris Hani, and so let's forget about the negotiation process. Let's forget about peace building. It's time for war. And that was explicitly what Janus Valus, the assassin, his accomplice, Clive Derby Lewis, that's what they wanted. They wanted to spark this thing off. And that is where the leadership moment lay, in Nelson Mandela recognizing that moment, people around him in the ANC recognizing that moment, and essentially declawing, defanging that moment by Mandela's speech later on, and we can talk about this if you want to, Rene. That starts off by saying, a white man full of hate came to our country and murdered our beloved son, and a white woman saw this killer and called the cops and led to this. And so took the attempt to racialize, to set black against white, white against black, and basically lifted and said, these people are enemies of progress, are enemies of democracy, enemies of peace, and we must not fall into their trap. That was the key moment about that identification.
Well, it definitely, Archbishop Desmond Tutu spoke, as you quote him in the book. Everyone immediately did worry about a race war, and understood. I'm repeating what you just said, but understood that's what this. Well, it may be a bigger group, as you suggest, actually, but at least the three people that are known and admitted to be involved were, and I'm including Clive and Gay, Darby Lewis. That was the 100% the aim. The trick was, yes, that for one thing, things had changed a bit, but it's something that you get a sense right away that it had to be played very carefully, because by the leadership. And it was, and you mentioned Mandela's speech. He gave a speech that very night, because this happened the first thing in the morning. But there's a very long and very interesting aspect to how he found his way back, actually, to Johannesburg, because he was in Ciskei, right?
Yes.
Yeah, at his traditional home,
Yes.
And so I think it's a long story, but maybe I want to say, you seem to understand something that hasn't been understood before, which was he didn't just hurry back home and make this famous speech to the nation. But after de Klerk did another right move, basically asked him to take over the leadership at that moment. And that was not necessarily de Klerk's first instinct to do that in previous times, troubled times, right? But he looked at this and said, we need Mandela. And he did that. But so Mandela, what took him so long? Why, very quickly as you can, what took him so long, Mandela, to leave not just the technical aspects of getting back to Johannesburg, that was pretty far away, but why did he not show up, say, on primetime news, which you make a big note about?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a big fan of Nelson Mandela's. I want to say, and I know we always have these debates in South Africa particularly, and that debates at the moment among young people, that the generation of Nelson Mandela, the Ahmed Kathradas, the Walter Sisulus and others, that, were they as amazing as they are? Did they do the right things? What kind of freedom? What is the meaning of freedom today? And it's a huge questioning, and I enjoy that. I think we should all debate these issues, but I think there are some things that we should put our stake in the ground on, and one of it is that what we have been gifted by the generation of leader, it's not just the freedom that we enjoy today, it's also the values that they lived by, the examples they set in leadership terms and so forth. So that day, Nelson Mandela gets the news. It's about 10:30 in the morning, and he is obviously devastated. And there are many, at the time, some news reports said Mandela was struck by grief, he couldn't move and so forth. Other reports said, no, Mandela was icy calm and started thinking about what's the next move and so forth. One thing I know for sure is that Nelson Mandela made a lot of phone calls that morning, phone calls to his comrades who'd been with him in his, on Robben Island, afterwards on Paulsmoor. He consulted hugely. And then he spent the day, he decided to go and visit the family of Chris Hani in nearby Kofimvaba, where Chris Hani had been born and raised. And he spent about 2.5 hours there. And I wanted to tease out this. Was this a man of empathy who felt deeply the loss of a son and the loss that the Hani family was going through? Or was it someone who couldn't operate, who couldn't move? And it's something. I'm opening the door and leaving the door open to that. You know, we all grieve, and that he may have been struck by grief and maybe he couldn't move. And I leave that to people to debate. I see it in a different way. I see it as a deep empathy. Someone who wanted to say, Nelson Mandela had lost a son while he was in prison. The apartheid government did not allow him out of prison to bury that son. He suffered other tragedies while he was in prison. And I think the ability to feel others' pain, to have the ability to say, I'm going to go out and make sure that they're fine. I make a point of mentioning in the book several times in that week, Nelson Mandela was reaching out to Gilbert Hani, to the father of Chris Hani, to his mother, to other members of his family. He went almost every day with his comrades to visit the family, Dimpo Hani and others. So I make a point of that. And you can choose to look at it in two different ways. Is this a man of empathy, or was he struck by grief that he couldn't move? But he did actually move later on that evening. He got a plane and flew to Johannesburg. At the same time, he did wait at the airport and waited for Bantu Holomisa to return from Swaziland, Eswatini now, to fly with him to Johannesburg. And so it was multifaceted, but it was an interesting day. And I don't want to sugarcoat history. I wanted to Nelson Mandela and all these heroes of mine, if you will, to be seen, and for us to have the debate and make assessments, but to be seen in full as humans and as heroes as well, which I believe.
Well, I mean, certainly he did make that. You know, you came at it as you did just now. It certainly on my part wasn't a criticism, because in the way, when you look back, he made a speech that whatever was going to happen that night that people feared did not happen. Really, yeah. I mean, there was some violence and whatnot, but I mean, he set in motion the sort of collective saving, you know, of this path to democracy. They were just trying to save the path at that point, you know, to democracy. But let me ask you something that is sort of most intriguing, which is you yourself happened by not kind of fluke, I guess, maybe by fate, though. You were like 22 years old and you were on what amounted to your first assignment, practically. You were working for the Star. You were going in on a Saturday morning. Nothing was supposed to happen on the Easter weekend. Nothing. You were practically told to bring a book, you know, and, you know, sorry, but, you know, you'll have better days another time, more exciting days. And you were the person who was at the desk when the news came in. This incredible earth-shaking news came in that Chris Hani had been assassinated. Tell us about that moment, and then that also explains a lot about why you know what you know, and you know, you're so connected to this story. But tell us about that moment, and also about who you were at that time compared to these great leaders.
You know, thank you for that question. There were two things I also wanted to show, and I'll come back to your question. One of the things about that time, and you were there, so I wanted to recreate, because today we talk about this freedom and it's you know, a great moment in 1994, but there was a time when all of us, perhaps you as well, and you can talk, I'd like you to hear about the experience, where South Africa was almost like this massive ship where one day your hopes are up and you're saying we're making progress. And then the Sebokeng massacre happens, or the Boipatong massacre happens. And for our guests, these were essentially attacks on communities funded by secret military intelligence linked forces, where 60, 70 people would be killed by allegedly members of the Inkatha Freedom Party led by Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi. But there was always a sinister hand. The police would escort them and so forth and so forth. And all this came out later on in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so, you know, you'd feel like the negotiations are on the up and up, and we are close to a solution and to an agreement, and then it would fall again. And so driving to work, going to work and listening to the radio was always this, you know, we stopped counting the number of people who died in killings. On average, 4,000 people. In the entire time between 1990, when you arrived, Renee, and 1994, 14,000 people were killed in political violence. So it was a hugely uncertain time. And you add this match to an already explosive situation. This was the big provocation of that moment. So I wanted to bring that in a bit. But I was actually a trainee at the Star at the time. So the company used to have a kind of cadet school, they called it. And you'd sit there learning shorthand and reporting techniques, the 5 Y, W's and a Y or whatever it was. And then you know, for our guests in the US, you know, Thanksgiving is big here, and people take off and go visit relatives. Easter is a bit like that in South Africa. Nelson Mandela went off to Qunu. F.W. de Klerk went to the Karoo, to his grandmother's farm. Most of the leaders, the senior people on the newspaper, everyone got out of town to visit relatives, to spend the Easter weekend, which is a 4-day weekend with their families. And so it was people like me, the rookies, who were left behind to essentially just call the say, what is there anything interesting? No, thank you, and no, thank you. And it is this weekend when Chris Hani tells his 3 bodyguards, you know, nothing's going to happen. You guys go off to your families. And they do. And he's on his own. He's spending the weekend with his daughter. And he doesn't realize that he's been stalked by this killer who follows him and shoots him in front of his 13-year-old daughter at the time and kills him. And then it all blows up. So you know, it was, I mean, I tell the story that it was my first day. It was to illustrate just how, for many of us, that time was a time of great hope. For me, it was after all these years of apartheid, of lack of opportunity for my parents, for Black people in general. This was a new beginning for the country, for individuals like me, who would probably not have made it into that newsroom in the past, or just barely made it. This was a new country and a new beginning. And so to see Chris Hani murdered, and to hear about his murder, and to go to the house and see his lifeless body on the ground was devastating. I personally, as a 22-year-old, just felt like, what is this? What does it mean that we're moving forward, that this is progress, when leaders can just be murdered in broad daylight like that? So there was it was a real setback that I felt viscerally, and I think most freedom-loving people were feeling the same thing. That what is the meaning of this negotiation process if this can happen, and if this is happening, and the anger that erupted from that is what, you know, leaders like Mandela, Tambo, Ahmed Kathrada, all of them had to confront, that it was widespread anger and a deep questioning of these outcomes.
I would, I mean, I think, am I?
So I think Renee is muted. I can't hear her.
Oh, yeah. Am I? There we go. Sorry. Just quickly, first of all, there's people, I just want to let people know that there will be a question and answer right after this, because I'm sure everybody can think of something they want to know more about what you're just saying. I'm interested in a sense, how you got there. And that is, there was a moment in time, you were 22, you managed to, you didn't come from wealth by any means. You have described yourself as part of the lost generation, which everybody, I think, are familiar with that expression. That was the generation, I mean, that was never good. You know, Black South Africans never had it good, but hitting the 50s and 60s, school, even Bantu education, became exactly like no education at all. So you rose in a situation where everything was hard for you. There was no question when you were a young child that you were going to end up as a reporter, or who you are today, actually. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think
nothing was given to you in the way of education or opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, for many South Africans in the room, this will sound sort of familiar, but I mean, thinking about it and taking some distance from it, you know, the apartheid government comes in 1948. They implement Bantu education, as you correctly point out, and this is basically the decimation of quality Black education, and so you get racialized education, and that's, you know, this level for whites, and they're meant to go to university and become engineers and so forth. And for Blacks and Blacks in general and Africans in particular, this level of education and so forth. But the 1980s were particularly dire, Renee, because the violence emanating from the government's repression led to many schools being closed. So in 1986, for example, there were at least 8,000 young people in political detention without trial by the police. Many schools were shut down and so forth. So many people didn't get much schooling in 1986. If you say to many of my contemporaries who lived particularly in Soweto and other parts, if they didn't manage to get into some sort of private schooling, they spent a year without school. And so this was
how did you avoid that? What within your family and within yourself?
Well, if you take 1986, you know, my school was shut down for 6 months of the year. We went back and the teachers really didn't have any option but to just bump us up to the next class and take in the next cohort. And I think about it a lot about, you know, what did that mean? Thankfully for my family, even though I didn't come from a privileged background as such, you know, we kept ourselves going by reading. You know, our father insisted that we always read the newspaper, for example, and we had to read it so that when he comes back from working in the mines in Johannesburg, he'd sit us down on Saturday mornings. That was his day off, and Sunday mornings. And we'd have to tell him what it read in the paper. And in a way, it was a way to get us reading, but it was also conscientization, but because you pick up a whole bunch of stuff that's really happening in the country, even with the censorship of the time. But that's how an individual like myself kind of, I think, managed to get through and get to go to university. But one of the key things about what they did is that institutionally it was devastating. In my high school graduation class, what we call matric in South Africa, it's shocking that I was the only one who went to university in that year. In 1988, I mean, at the end of that school year. And so you just see how institutionally this broke. There were so many kids in that class. It's absolutely unconscionable that should happen, that would happen. So those are some of the things that are the background of what happened. So you ask about how did one get there? You know, I couldn't drive. So you always had drivers, people who basically.
I don't know if I'm the only one hearing that or not. But,
Yeah, I'm still here.
yeah, and we're still recording. Well, I'm going to do a couple of leaps into quick, they're not so quick, but just quick questions about that I think are fascinating about this exact moment in time, those 9 days. One thing, it's been generally, I mean, and legally, I mean, at this point in time, there's the two people who are designated legally as the killers of Chris Hani are Jonas Wallace and Clive Derby Lewis. His wife was not, I believe she was, I can't remember if Gay was, I'm sorry, she wasn't tried at all. The charges were dropped, am I right? But
she was acquitted.
Acquitted then. But you suggest right from the beginning, right from the day that the police went in and looked at that you were reporting on, that looked at what was in the Wallace's house, that there was just too many questions. Rattle off some of the questions why he did it that day, which seemed kind of crazy, why he drove a red car, which seems a little crazy if you're trying to get away, why he didn't really change his plates on the back of the car or didn't do it well. I mean, and all these various suggestions that he either wanted to be caught, he either wanted to be caught and then protected, that there were others. I mean, it's not an easy thing to say, but I mean, your questions basically.
My questions, there's one big question and there's other smaller questions. My biggest one is the investigation itself. And, you know, I'll go through, Jonas Wallace was interrogated for days and he confessed after being interrogated by a security branch policeman. This security branch policeman is a notorious man who has emerged as one of the key torturers in the case of various anti-apartheid detainees in the 1980s, 1990s. He has boasted about his interrogation of Ismail Ibrahim, who was a well-known freedom fighter in South Africa. He was involved in, there are so many. He is currently, the police are considering laying charges against him for various deaths in detention, where he was the last person to interrogate people.
And that was Craig. He's actually a pretty known name, Craig Coetzee.
No, it wasn't. It was Nick. I'm forgetting what's in my own book.
Sorry, then I'm not going to help. Somebody will come up with it later.
It's not Craig Williams though. It's
oh, you're talking. Okay, fine. Yeah.
It's Nick Carlos.
Well, proceed. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have thrown that out there.
But this is.
I'll look it up in the book in a second.
This is and so you have this situation where where this case, where the security branch comes in, and it's not clear how it's involved, and it gets a confession from Justice Malala. And the case is very neatly tied up. It's very neat, and it's a strong case, and it gets a conviction. And I think that's all good and okay. But the questions about why is it the key police investigators are essentially fed these convenient facts by the security branch, whose role is never really explained, is it's still a question for me. But then, you know, there are other questions. There are questions about the people around Clive W. Lewis and Justice Malala, the two convicted murderers. There are questions about the small circle of people who were around them. So was this some sort of terror cell or not? I don't think that question has been answered properly. And then there are other clues about possible military intelligence involvement. I think the key one in that sense is that you can see the propaganda machine that had been at work around Chris Hani and demonizing him in the weeks and months beforehand. Just 2 weeks before he was murdered, there was a story in the main Afrikaans newspapers and leaked to the Sunday Times in London that he was starting an army with the help of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, without any evidence whatsoever that this was happening, that he was leaving the ANC and going to start off on his own. It was almost as if he was being decoupled from the ANC. Even the fact that he was part of the ANC's negotiating team he was being decoupled and being set up for murder, for vilification and so forth. So those are some of the key questions that haven't been answered about this. And I have to say, my big question is that these are not fresh questions. Jeremy Cronin back in 1994 was asking these questions. The SA Communist Party has asked these questions. My sadness here is that the African National Congress has been in power for 29 years and has not answered these questions, or has not opened up in such a way to get these questions answered. And I don't mean about just this assassination, but there are questions about some of the things that happened between 1990 and 1994 that may be worth a revisit, if you will.
Well, I mean, of course, the flip side of all of, I mean, it's a totally different question, but or area, but it didn't work. Whoever was involved, whatever the story is, which we'd all like to know, it didn't work, and quite the opposite happened. Yeah. It actually, as sad and awful as it was, I think it was Bantu Holomisa who wrote, you quote, in fact I know what you quote, you said what occurred was actually, he used the word miraculous over the next 9 days, and it did exactly the opposite. It cemented and moved forward the move towards a real democracy. So we don't, you and I, we have a good 10 minutes after this for questions, and I know there are a lot of people would like to know, is there anything just that sort of briefly, the other calls that were made over those 9 days, if you had to name one or two of them that made the turn or clinch the beyond Mandela's speech the first night, who clinched the fact that this was not gonna triumph, this assassination and this desire to bring the country down, what would they be? It's a really hard question, because this book, and I mean that sincerely, because this book is so full of details and so full of small, tiny things that stick out. But if you could name even one or two that, you know, that got them to the end, that they got Holomisa saying this is a miracle.
Yeah, I think I think the first thing was the ANC on the Sunday after the murder, so on the 11th of April, held a National Executive Committee meeting. And you know, that meeting really consolidated around what do we do next? And it was, let's allow people to mourn. Let's not say stay at home. Let's allow people to show, to march, to go hold memorial services in their churches and so forth. Let's give them space to show what they're feeling. And I think that was pivotal, allowing the emotion to be expressed rather than suppressing it, telling people, no, don't, calling for peace, but an empty kind of, oh, you know, don't do anything, just keep calm. It wasn't like that. It was go out and march and show your, and vent. And I think that was a big moment. But Archbishop Desmond Tutu, all the ANC leaders, not all of them, I mean, I point out in the book that there were people who were saying, what is the point of going ahead? And this is an important moment for consensus building when people then agree that no, actually, let us not allow ourselves to be deflected by this. Let us move forward. So key among those were younger leaders in the ANC, Bazima Shilowa, who at the time people knew as Sam Shilowa, was a key voice in that week. People like Tokyo Sehwale, who was a well-known anti-apartheid former prisoner. He'd been on Robben Island for 13 years. You know, even in their grief and anger, and you know, Tokyo Sehwale, a very well-known image of him crying, I think it's in the book as well, at the house on that day. But all these people.
I just said with Tokyo, he was considered quite fierce by whites, especially, obviously. And what he was seen to be doing was crying. I mean, shedding tears. Sad.
Yeah. No,
on television in South Africa at that time.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Renee. That was one of the key moments when people considered very much like Chris Hani, like others, that, oh, these are men of war. But to actually that image and that day when people saw, it was a big media moment that translated that this is pain. You don't kill people, you don't assassinate political opponents and so forth. It was a big moment it was a big symbolic moment for South Africa, for the whole nation, to actually stop and say that the father of children, a man of peace, a man who had been preaching peace for all this time, who was in the peacemaking process, had been murdered. And it in many ways, it doesn't need to be humanized. I mean, we are all human, we should have, our pain should be, but it did humanize that pain and translate it to people who might have been heartless in their response to it, if you will. So I think that was a big moment, and we all remember it as you do, because it was a picture that was a turning moment. But about I think people like Peter Mokaba, who was the leader of the ANC youth wing at the time, a well-known, very fierce, militant young man, but he took on the message that no, we're going to make sure that this doesn't derail the bigger goal. He was among quite a few who said we will continue to show people that this is the way it goes. And you know, Peter Mokaba went all sorts of ways, and he'd make very fiery statements, but he stayed on course with the general message that they want us to fight, they want us to blow up what we're building, and let's not allow them. And I think there were key messages like that came out from particular leaders, and that's what held it together. I think it was a I think there's one moment where Muhammad Ali, who happened to be in South Africa in that week, goes and visits Oliver Tambo, who was ailing at the time. He was the former president of the ANC, who had held it together through 30 years of exile. And they have a discussion, and Muhammad Ali comes out and says, well, Oliver Tambo told me that you know, people are expressing themselves and it's venting, but it will get through it. And messages like that from people like Oliver Tambo were key, showing people that.
Well, it sounds, I mean, I would say this is fair to the book too. If you had to say 3 words about what happened and what made it all, what saved the country, was leadership. Yeah, and you know, I'm sorry to say, my part of this has come to an end. In fact, we're a little late on that, and we wanted to open it up for questions. And there is a list of, there are a number of questions in front of me, but I'm sorry to do this because I didn't quite realize. Is it possible for people to ask their own questions, or should I just move through this list as much as I can in the 8 minutes that we have left? And I guess in this moment, Sharon might join us again just to direct.
Renee, why don't you do that? Read the questions. That would be helpful.
Okay. Some of them you've answered, and this is sort of a lovely one because it struck me too very much, because I'm still very much in touch with South Africa. What lessons can young adults 18 to 35 learn from the book that will be helpful for them to remember when they vote in 2024? And this, I know all the South Africans know this, maybe the Americans not, or the others listening that are not South African don't really. This would be the group called the Born Frees. That is people who functionally were born after Mandela was released in 1990. Those are people who never lived through the apartheid that you lived through in any real sense. What lessons do you think they should take, or even you there? I mean, you know, where are they at, in a sense?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Renee, that's a very difficult question, and thank you to the guest who asked it. I would say, so for me, I also wanted in that week to illustrate some of the leadership points that I think we miss in our current, not just South African political life, but I think globally. And one of the things that happens, you mentioned the conversation between F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela on that Saturday, in which de Klerk says, and he said this verbatim, there's nothing I can do. I mean, I'm the president of the country, but really the leadership belongs to Nelson Mandela. And he steps back, and Nelson Mandela goes on television that evening and goes back on television 3 days later and gives that incredible speech that talks about the man of hate and the white woman who saw the killer. So there are 2 things, and the first one is that Nelson Mandela chose to collaborate with an opponent, and what many people would say was an enemy, and that's F.W. de Klerk. In this moment of crisis, it was, do we inherit a country that's in ashes, or do we work together to avert disaster? And he chose collaboration. The 2 men chose collaboration. And I think it's a powerful statement to be able, as young leaders like the person who sent in the question, to say, what do we want for South Africa in 20 years or 30 years? I don't want to be in my retirement in a country that's ashes. I want it to be a better country than it is today. So I think it's an important thing to consider in our heads as we go to the election in 2024. It's to begin to envision the country we want in 10 years, 20 years time, And perhaps that will help lift us out of our own partisan tracks, and be able to say, perhaps it's time to hold out my hand of collaboration to certain other like-minded values, people whose values we share, and work together to avert that. I think this is a key moment 30 years after 1994, that those lessons have to be learned. There are other lessons that are really, I think we can draw from that week and from those leaders in that time. They were values driven. They were not, it was not just about defeating apartheid. It was about building a new country, an incredible vision of non-sexism, of non-racialism, and I mean this by non-racialism in the South African sense, where you're fully aware of the structural and historical issues, but you also move forward saying, I'm not going to be like what apartheid was like. So the ideal of a united, non-racial, non-sexist, and democratic South Africa was such a powerful one, and we need to fashion another one, or we need to revisit those values at this time. So I think there's a lot to learn there, about collaboration, about stepping forward, about stepping back, about reaching out to the other side, that are really necessary in this moment, not just in South Africa, but globally. Thank you, Renée.
That, I think, that gets us to, you've actually answered some of the questions that are in here as far as I can see. But I wonder if there's new elements in the world of South Africa that could not have been predicted, or were not predicted, that are outside the framework of lessons that you're speaking of, as in corruption, as in even just the social media, various things that will be a barrier or not, to the country reaching its heights and doing for all of its citizens what was promised, or at least aimed for 30 years ago. And it was exactly 30 years ago when Chris Hani was killed.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I think, Renée, one of the things about why today are we thinking so deeply about the legacy of Ahmed Kathrada, or Nelson Mandela, or Walter Sisulu, Joe Slovo, and so forth. And I think part of it is that at times of great peril personally and to their movement, these are men and women who stood up for certain ideals, for certain values that carry us through today. One of the reasons why we're having this conversation for me is that the history and the memory of people like Ahmed Kathrada, Chris Hani, is almost a rebuke to some of the practices that we've seen in South Africa today. So the corruption that we all know is so endemic and has become endemic, particularly over the past 2 administrations in South Africa. So we remember these people, these leaders, and what they did, because we are disappointed with the South Africa of today. We are shocked by the corruption, the lack of values, the discarding of many of the values that these leaders stood for. So I think the challenge is that there are many new iterations of the challenge, the misinformation that we've seen, the attacks on the free press in the case of the sector that you and I work in, and so forth and so forth, and so many others. However, I think I think those values are also what can get us through the next 10, 20 years. I think standing for these ideals gives one a context to stand up against the use of misinformation, disinformation, to undermine institutions, to undermine civil society. So I think it may have changed in many ways, but at the heart of it, I think the examples that we have, and in South Africa, I'm so happy and so proud to say that we've got these examples in abundance. I think we can get through. I'm still hopeful. I'm still hopeful that we can get through. But I think these are very, very dangerous times where we have to really push and fight to get back on track. And I'm, I very much agree with many people who say that we are, we have imperiled ourselves by allowing some of these things to flourish, and corruption is a key part of that.
Well, Justice Malala, it was my great pleasure to speak with you today. And we are going to, and thank you to the Kathrada Foundation. Sharon, I think I'm going to hand this off to you just now for the moment, or Palesa, for the both of you, for a post commentary. And thank you all for joining from me. There we go. Hi. I love Zooms, actually. It's like a party.
Okay.
So it's Palesa.
Yes.
Shall I just so take it away, and then I'll put myself back?
Yes,
on
I
mute?
will. I will take it away from here. Thank you so much, Renee, and Justice, for that conversation. The plot to Save South Africa is indeed a great read, which I cannot recommend enough. And it was great to hear from the first drafters of history, which journalism is often referred to as that first draft of history. But interestingly, we also have oral historians, and these are the people who were there when stuff was going down. And you'll find a lot of such people in this book. And so we're very fortunate that one of those key players in that week is with us here today. His name is Rolf Meyer. I'm sure many of you know Rolf. He was the chief negotiator on behalf of the apartheid government, the National Party at that time. And him and our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, representing the African National Congress, would often appear together on television to give us updates, breakthroughs, and breakdowns, and several breakdowns at that. So if members here, I want to thank you very much for your time in agreeing to take a couple of questions. I wonder if you could perhaps take a couple of minutes and really take us back to where you were when the call came that Chris Hani had been killed, and what went through your mind, especially given the fact that the talks between the National Party and the African National Congress had broken at that time.
Well, thank you very much for putting me on the spot.
If we can, sorry, Rolf, if we can just get you on Spotlight, if technical can do that for us. Thank you so much. Yes, go ahead.
Tell me. Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Justice for publishing this book, for writing the story, for reminding us. Chris Hani was a great person, and it was a huge loss for us at the time that he left us. In the 3 years that I knew him, I think I can say that we became good friends, and he undoubtedly would have played a major role in the future of South Africa from there onwards. But you know, what comes to my mind, two things I would like to share. The one is that the assassination of Chris was another one of those moments where the determination of the people of the leadership carried us through. In sharing our experience with others in conflict, I often think about the way in which irreversibility played a role in our situation. And what I mean is that the day that Madiba walked out of prison, the whole process became irreversible. In other words, we had to go forward. And there were devastating moments on more than one occasion. For instance, the boycott in Chris's assassination in 1993. And every time the leadership took us through that, helped us to overcome. It's so good that, Justice, you have spotlighted again the importance of that moment. But in the bigger context, we just knew that we had to carry on. We had to find ways. And if I look at what you have written up, Justice, it emphasizes and recollect and memorize for us what happened in those few days. From a personal angle, can I just share with you, and I don't think I've ever shared it with you, Justice, in our interviews or the interviews that you did with me in writing the book. How I became aware of Chris's death was at Agulhas, the most southern point of Africa,
Yes.
in the Southern Cape. And I was there, like Justice was saying, with my family and friends for the weekend. And we were out there on the Saturday morning searching for periwinkle on the rocks. And suddenly my second daughter appeared. She was 15 at the time, and she was calling out loudly. And as she was running towards me, she shouted and said, "Chris Hani was killed." That was how I heard the first time. And this is a moment of devastation for me. And the next days was, as is reflected in the book. But what I wanted to share, a deep human moment, because 9 years later, my same daughter, who called me to tell me about the death of Chris Hani, was killed in a car accident 9 years later. And you know what? One of the first people who called me when the news broke about that, one of the first people who called me in person was Madiba to share his condolences. That was 3 years after he left the office of president. I was out of politics by then. He didn't have to do it. There was no political connection between us any longer. He just did it as a human being. And I think these are the type of lessons that we can all share with each other, and that we have to carry forward. I noticed some of the questions that was on the screen. And what we have to learn from that experience in 1993, I think we have to share with each other on a regular basis to say, we as South Africans can do it. We just have to get rid of the bad things, of the crooks, and of the terrible disasters that happen around us. But we can do it like Madiba did it at that time and showed us the way. We have to repeat it on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. I really, really want to thank you for your time, and that's all the time we have for. I just wanted to thank you for your time and your contribution to, and to say that history will always remember the role that you played in that difficult transition to bring about the new South Africa. So thank you very much, and I will hand over to my colleague Hitan to take us home.
Thank you, Palesa. Thank you, Palesa, for that. On behalf of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation and the US Friends of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, I really want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our speakers, both Renee and Justice, and to Rolf for sharing their perspectives, Dankie meneer. I think I would be remiss not to thank not just the participants who spoke to us today, but also all the people that took their Saturday mornings over a long weekend in South Africa join us today. It means a lot for us, for you to be here and for you to take the time and engage with us on this very engaging and personal stories that we heard today, and lessons that we can all learn. And I hope we can all continue these conversations with each other. I also want to take the time to thank the co-sponsors of this event today. On the US side, it's Shared Interest, the South Africa Development Fund, and South Africa Partners. Of course, the staff at the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation can't thank you enough for all the time you've put into preparing this today, all the behind the scenes work that happens. It's a lot of work, and we really, really appreciate it for all the work that you've done. Can I get the next slide, please? For those of you that don't know, the US Friends of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation is a grouping of people from both the US and Canada who were very close to Mr. Ahmed Kathrada, or Uncle Kathy, or Kathy, that many of us know. And we've come together to really figure out how we can work closely with the foundation in South Africa to pursue and the values of Mr. Kathrada, to help the foundation in South Africa to organize around different events and programs like this, to continue strengthen democracy and our push for non-sexist, non-racist South Africa, but also try to spread that message around the world. And we do advise the foundation on US and Canadian outreach where possible. Really want to share, can't stress enough, please stay connected with the foundation through the Twitter feeds, through Facebook, to Instagram, YouTube. Beyond just learning more about programs like this, there are tons of different information and events that you'll hear about the foundation, including multiple press releases, and so you can find out more about what's also happening on the ground. I do want to thank the members of the US Friends of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, all of whom have been incredibly active here and play an incredible role in everything that we do and in supporting the foundation. Please continue. Next slide, please. For those that are in the US or Canada, please try to support this work. You can make tax-deductible donations if you're in the US to the South Africa Development Fund and earmark it for the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. And we really, really appreciate all your support, however you can. Spread the word about the foundation, and please continue to stay in touch. And we want to, we hope we see you at future webinars. We'll be doing many more of these in the future. Thank you once again to everyone who've been here, and we hope you have a lovely long weekend and we can continue these conversations. Thank you.